We first looked at our good dead friend Immanuel Kant in the context of his categorical imperative. And as you might recall from that earlier part of the course, Kant is classified as a rule deontologist in that he holds that the correct approach to ethics is to follow the right moral rules and not break them. And a system for determining these rules is, of course, the categorical imperative. We also saw when we looked at Kant earlier, he divides reality into two distinct categories. There are rational beings like us who have moral worth, and then there are what he calls the objects of the inclinations. That is to say, all things that are non-rational, which would include obvious objects like sticks and stones and clocks and rocks and sandwiches, but would also include for him animals. And he contended that these objects have no moral status of their own, going back to our older terminology, that they have no intrinsic value. However, in the case of animals, as we'll see, he contends that they get a special sort of value. Now, for Kant, before getting to animals, any object can have extrinsic value. It can derive value from us valuing it. So, interestingly, as we'll see, Kant takes a approach to animals which is both consistent with the view he presents in the discussion of the categorical imperative, but also ends up giving animals considerable sort of pseudo-moral status. So without further ado, to Kant, Duties Towards Animals, from his lectures on ethics in 1780. So he begins by talking about Baumgarten, another philosopher who talks about duties towards beings which are beneath us and those which are above us. Kant's stance, and given what he said in the categorical imperative, is that we have no direct duties towards animals, but he's going to use a bit of philosophical legerdemain in order to get us to have, again, kind of special sorts of duties, not to animals directly, but kind of indirectly. As we saw when we talked about the categorical imperative part of ethics, he regards animals as objects. They're merely means. And the reason for this is pretty standard in what we consider to be European and American thought, which is the view among philosophers that animals are not self-conscious and hence merely means to an end. We looked previously at our good dead friend Descartes, who presented the view that animals have no immaterial minds. So ends are, for Kant, us, humans. And as part of his reasoning, he says we can ask the question meaningfully, why do animals exist? Because they would have purposes, they're means to an end. And in the case of us, asking why does man, humans, why we exist, he claims is a meaningless question, although he seems to be incorrect about that. Now, he does allow, as we'll see as he develops his argument, that we do have duties towards animals, but not in the sense of having actual duties towards animals. They are merely, for him, indirect duties we have towards other humans. So, how does he work this philosophical magic? Well, he begins by looking at an argument essentially by analogy, a very common argument used when comparing things, of course. And he asserts that if we do our duties towards animals, and again, his view is we have no direct duties to animals, but if we act towards them in the way that we'd act towards an analogous human being, we indirectly do our duty to humanity. And he uses the example of a dog, an older dog that has served long and faithfully, and he believes that this dog deserves reward, but in a special sort of way. That even when the dog has grown too old to serve in its past role, say before it was like a hunting dog, and in its youth it would plunge into the freezing ocean and swim out and bite onto a wounded duck or dead duck and bring it back to shore. But now the dog is old and can no longer leap into cold water and can do little other than kind of sleep contentedly, dreaming of past glories. But Kant believes that this person ought to keep the dog and take good care of it until the dog dies. And the reason for this is that this action, this treatment of animals, helps us develop our duties towards other humans. And in the case of humans, we do have, not surprisingly given Kant's views, we have duties towards them. So the way it would work, expanding on the analogy, is this. If there's an animal who acts in ways that are analogous to humans and arise from similar principles, we would develop similar indirect duties towards animals that we would have towards humans under the same analogous circumstances. So essentially that if an animal acts in a way that would, create a duty towards a human, we would owe an indirect duty towards that animal. Now, in the case of going back to the dog example, going back to the old hunting dog, if the owner shoots the dog because it's grown too old to hunt, Kant says the person does not fail in their duty to the dog because the dog is not rational. The dog cannot engage in moral judgment, at least according to Kant, although anybody who's had a dog probably would think otherwise. But he believes that the dog is not rational, cannot judge, and that's what morality is all about. So the dog itself has not been failed. However, the action of killing this dog would be inhuman and would damage this person's humanity. And as Kant sees it, we do have an obligation to show humanity to other humans. So to avoid essentially damaging our psychology, our feelings, we must be kind to animals. And his belief is that essentially it's a progression. That if someone is cruel to animals, they become bad in dealings with other people. And he believes, as many people do, that we can judge the heart of a person by how they treat animals. Now, to illustrate this, he references some famous engravings by this fellow Hogarth. Not the Hogarth from the Iron Giant, if you're familiar with that movie, but a very different Hogarth. And in these engravings show how cruelty grows and develops. And so it begins with a child being cruel. And here are the illustrations. So first it shows a child, cruelly tormenting a dog. And then it progresses to, the person behaving even worse. And then progresses to the final stage of cruelty, where the person moves on from, tormenting animals to being kind of a danger to others. And then finally culminating in murder. And of course, this is essentially a moral lesson. And so the final end is the reward of cruelty. And kind of disturbingly shows the person as a cadaver in what then was medical school, obviously not practicing very good sanitary techniques, because there's, I guess, the dog that was tormented feasting on the organs of the person. So yeah, that got pretty awful pretty quick. But that's kind of Kant's point, that cruelty begets cruelty and more cruelty. And then, of course, there's a little moral lesson there that it ends up with a bad end. But returning back to animals, Kant, despite his kind of reputation, for being very focused on rationality, he seemed to, at least in his writings, really like animals. He asserts that the more we come into contact with animals and observe them, the more we love them, because we can see how great they care for their young. And then he says it's difficult to be cruel in thought, even to a wolf. That essentially, the more we understand animals psychologically, the more we care about them. And he gives the example of our good dead friend Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. Leibniz was also, technically not German, because Germany as such didn't exist when Leibniz was around, but what later became what we now know as Germany. Leibniz was a early modern rationalist philosopher, influenced in many ways by Descartes, but he was known also for his kindness. And in one story, he was observing a tiny worm and carefully returned it to avoid harming it back to its leaf, probably a caterpillar, and he would have been sorry to destroy it. A natural feeling for such a humane person. And Kant believes that our tender feelings towards animals develops humane feelings towards all of humanity. And he notes, correctly. I actually, years ago, looked this up just to confirm that it was true. In England, it used to be true that butchers and doctors could not sit on a jury. And the reasoning behind it was because they were supposedly accustomed to the sight of death and hardened against death. So the thought was they would be less humane. Now, in the United States, of course, you can't get exempt from jury duty by putting down that you're a butcher. Doctors also don't get exempt unless they're on call, etc. But as always, when it comes to jury duty, be sure to check your local rules. Now, Kant again believes that animals are, inferior to humans, and so even though he does believe we should treat them well, because essentially if we treat them badly, we'll become, worse and end up potentially being bad to other people and failing our moral duties. And so, a way, something I expand on later in our next subject, which is looking at the artificial beings and their rights, is that Kant seems to present animals as kind of a moral practice. So if you are cruel to animals, the animals themselves have no rights, but a person would become cruel to people. So to use an analogy, kind of like with CPR. CPR dummy, of course, is just plastic. It's a thing. You can't fail in your duty to the CPR dummy because it's not even alive. But if someone screws around during CPR training, again, they can't do harm to the dummy. They can break it, of course, but they can't do moral harm to the dummy. But if they screw around during training, when they go to try to help a person for real, they're likely to fail. And so it's kind of a similar thing. So roughly put, animals get kind of a virtual or pseudo-moral status, in a way kind of as practice, because if we're bad to them, then we'll become more likely to be bad to people. Now, of course, they still are inferior to us as Kant sees it, so he does allow for some mistreatment of animals. And the example he selects is, or focuses on, is vivisectionists. And vivisection is, it comes from vive, alive, section, to cut. Literally means, and I mean literally, not figuratively literally, but it involves cutting up animals while they're alive in the course of experiments. Now, Kant acknowledges that this is a cruel action. Now, the vivisectionists who are doing scientific research and medical research, were doing it, one hopes, for good purposes. They're trying to get an understanding of organs, blood, living creatures. And before we had things like X-rays and MRIs, the only way to know what was going on inside a living creature would be to cut into it while it was still alive. And that, of course, is as cruel as it sounds, and Kant acknowledges that. But if someone is doing legitimate research, meaningful research, Kant considers this praiseworthy, their aim at least. And he still regards it as cruelty, but justifiable cruelty in those cases, because he still holds, despite this seemingly enlightened view towards animals he believes are still objects and are instruments. They exist for our purposes. However, he does put some strict limits on it. Such cruelty for sport, he believes, cannot be justified. So if someone was dissecting an animal in order to, today doing animal experiments, say experimenting on rats to develop a cure for cancer, and, giving them cancer to treat them, Kant, if he was alive today, would say that would truly be cruel, but morally acceptable. But if someone was merely being cruel to animals, for example, making dogs fight, as a sport, he would say that this cannot be justified. And he notes that someone who turns out their animal, their dog, etc., because the animal can no longer earn their keep, and manifest a very small mind. And he notes the Greek fable about the ass and the bell of the ass being like a horse-like animal, like a donkey-like creature, and the bell of ingratitude. And so he believes that our duties towards animals then are indirect duties towards mankind. So here is as a bonus side, is the fable of the ass, again, donkey. So the fable is this, very short. A diligent ass, daily loaded beyond his strength by a severe master, whom he had long served, and who fed him very sparingly, happened one day in his old age to be oppressed with a more than ordinary burden of earthenware. His strength being much impaired, and the road deep and uneven, they unfortunately made a trip, and able to recover himself, fell down and broke all the vessels to pieces. His master, transported with rage, began to beat him unmercifully, against which the poor ass, lifting up his head as he lay on the ground, thus strongly remonstrated, "Unfailing wretch, to thy own vivacious cruelty in first pinching me of food, and then loading me beyond my strength, thou owest a misfortune which thou so unjustly imputest to me." And that's the fable. So that takes us to the end of our good dead friend Immanuel Kant's view of animals. And again, the quick recap is, for Kant, given his view of ethics, rational beings have moral worth, objects of the inclination, everything that's not rational does not. Animals thus would be objects, so they would not have moral status of their own. However, they do get an indirect or pseudo or virtual moral status because, according to Kant, if a person is cruel to animals, they'll become cruel to people, thus failing their duties to people. So the duty is indirect. Because we have obligations to people, we have indirect duties to animals, to treat them well, to avoid being cruel to others. And thus concludes Kantian's view of duties towards animals.